Good evening. Today I will be presenting my project for the class. Uh, this project we will investigate the United States economies uh, for a market analysis of different companies. Uh, the companies that we will analyze are Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, Walmart, Tesla, ExxonMobil, Amazon, Nvidia, Johnson & Johnson, and General Electrics. Starting with Apple, we'll look into the assets, which have a total asset balance starting out at the 5-year mark, or the first year, of $323.89 billion, and after 5 years raising up to $364.98 billion. The structure of the assets is 55.68% current assets and 44.37% current non-current assets in the first year, and 58.08% at current assets and 41.92% non-current assets by the 5th year. Moving on to the equities and liabilities. Equities structure is 20%, well 20.17% in the first year and moves to 15.6% in the 5th year. The current asset liabilities are 32.54% in the first year and 47.29% in the 5th year. Non-current assets start out at 48.33% in the first year and 36.07% in the 5th year. Moving on to revenues, the total revenue starts out at $274.52 billion at the first year and moves up to $391.4 billion in the 5th year. The rate of increase is 43.64% from year 1 through 3, and it does decrease at a negative 0.83% rate from year 3 to 5. The total expenses start out at $169.5 billion in the first year and $210.35 billion in the 5th year. The rate of increase for the expenses is 31.84% in the first 3 years and negative 5.9% in the last 3 years. Now moving on to our next company is Microsoft. Looking at the assets, the total assets is $301.31 billion in the first year, and it goes up to $512.16 billion in the 5th year. Whenever moving on to the equities and liabilities, equity starts out at $118.3 billion and moves up to $216.48 billion by the 5th year, with a saturation of 39.26%. That goes up to 52.42% by the 5th year, with a current liability structure of 24% in the first year, and it goes up to 26.56% in the 5th year, and a non-current liability structure of 36.7% to 23.12% in the 5th year. Moving on to the revenue. The total revenue goes from $143.02 billion to $245.12 billion. The rate of increase is 38.64% in the first year through 3rd year, and 23.63% from the 3rd year to the 5th year. Looking at the expenses, the total expenses goes from $95.17 billion up to $143.30 billion annually. The rate of increase for the first 3 years is 26.92%, and from year 3 to 5, it's 18.64%. Moving on to Alphabet, when looking at assets, the total assets is $319.62 billion, and it goes up to $450.26 billion by the fifth year. The rate of increase for this is 14.28% in the first through third year, and 23.727% in the third through fifth year. Current structure of current assets, or the structure of current assets in the first year is 54.53%, and it goes down to 36.36%. Non-current asset structure starts at 45.47% and goes up to 63.64%. Looking at equities and liability, looking at total equity, it goes from $222.54 billion to $325.08 billion by the fifth year. The rate of increase from the first year through third year is 15.1%, and the rate of increase in the third through fifth year is 26.19%. Looking at the structure of liabilities, current liabilities start out at 24% and then move up to 25.28%, and non-current liabilities start at 36.74% and go down to 23.12%. When looking at the revenue of Alphabet, total revenue is $182.53 billion for the first year, and it works its way up to $350.02 billion by the fifth year. The rate of increase from the first to third year is 54.96%, and the rate of increase for the third through fifth year is 23.75%. When looking at expenses, the total expenses is $141.3 billion, and it works its way up to $237.62 billion annually. The rate of increase in the first through third year is 47.2%, and the rate of increase between the third and fifth year is 14.25%. Moving on to Walmart. When looking at assets, total assets start at $236.5 billion, and on the first year and in the fifth year they are $252.4 billion. The rate of increase of total assets between the first and third year is 3.54% and 3.08% in the third through fifth year. Current asset structure in the first year is 26.3% and moves to 30.45% in the fifth year. For non-current assets, it's 73.87% in the first year and 69.54% in the fifth year. Equity structure is 34.48% in the first year and works its way down to 31.54% in the fifth year. Total equity goes from $81.55 billion to $83.86 billion by the fifth year. The rate of increase is 12.68% in the first through third year, and has a decrease of 8.74% from the third through fifth year. The structure of current liabilities starts at 32.89 in the first year and is at 36.61 in the fifth year. Non-current liabilities starts at 32.62% in the first year and goes down to 27.59 in the fifth year. Looking at Walmart's revenue, total revenue is at $523.96 billion. It works its way up to $648.25 billion annually. The rate of increase from the first through third year is 9.31, and in the third through fifth year is 13.63. Total expenses also climb from $503.39 billion up to $621.11 billion, at a rate of 8.62 for the first through third and 13.59 in the third through fifth year. Looking at Tesla, total assets start at $52.15 billion, go up to $122.07 billion. with a rate of 57.89% first through third year and 48.25% third through fifth year. The structure of current assets is 51.23 in the first year and 47.81 in the fifth year. Non-current assets is at 48.77 first year and 52.919 in the fifth year. Equity and liabilities. Equity starts at a structure of 42.62% and goes in the first year and 59.73% in the fifth year. Total equity goes from 22.23 billion to 72.91 billion with a growth rate of 101.14 for the first through third year and 63.10 for the third through fifth year. Current liabilities, goes from 27.32 in the first year down to 26.96 in the fifth year. And non-current assets go from 27.17 in the first year to 16.103 in the fifth year. Looking at revenue, total revenue annually goes from 31.54 billion up to 97.69 billion. Growth rate is 158.31% in the first through third year, and from the third through fifth year is 19.92. While expenses goes from 7.78 billion to 15.2 billion with a 43.21% increase from first through third year, and a 39.32% increase in the third through fifth year. ExxonMobil. Total assets start at 332.75 billion and go up to 453.48 billion annually at a rate of 10.91% in the first through third year and 22.87% in the last 3 years. The structure of assets is 33.49% current and 86.51% non-current in the first year, and 26.45% current and 73.55% non-current in the fifth year. Equity structure in the first year is 49.33 and in the fifth year is 59.67. Total equity goes from 161.3 to 270.6. The rate of increase from the first 3 years is 23.36, and in the last 3 years is 33.65. Current liabilities and non-current liability structure is 16.94% for current and 33.74 for non-current in the first year, and 15.5 and 24.82 respectively in the fifth year. Revenues of 180.5 billion go up to 349.59 billion by the fifth year, with a rate of 127.92% for the first 3 and a negative 15.49 for the last 3 years. Expenses of 210.39 billion up to 300.71 billion at a rate of 59.67% first 3 years and a negative 10.48% decrease in the last 3 years. Moving on to Amazon, total assets is 321.212 in the first year, going up to 624.89 in the fifth year. Current at a rate of 44.5 in the first 3 years and 35.6 in the last 3. The structure of current to non-current is 41.32 to 58.68 in the first year, and it shifts to a 30.54 and 69.46 shift in the fifth year. Looking at equity, 29.8% equity structure in the first year and 45.76% in the fifth year. Total equity goes from 93.4 billion to 285.97 billion by the fifth year. And this is a rate of 56.36% growth in the first 3 years and 95.81% in the last 3 years. Looking at liabilities, structure 39.35% for current and 31.57% for non-current. In the first year, 28.71% current and 25.52% non-current in the fifth year. The total revenue of Amazon for the first year was $386.06 billion, and it moved up to $637.95 billion at a rate of 33.13% in the first 3 years and 24.2% in the last 3 years. Expenses go from $363 billion to $569 billion at a rate of 38.16% in the first 3 years and a 13.48% in the last 3 years. NVIDIA's total assets go from 17.32 to 65.73 billion at a rate of 155% in the first 3 years and 45% in the last 3 years. The structure of current to non-current assets is 79 to 21 in the first year and 56 to 44 in the fifth year. Equity structure goes from 70% to 65%. Total equity goes from 12.2 to 42.9 billion. That's a rate of 118% in the first 3 years and 61% in the last 3 years. Current liabilities goes from 10% to 16% structure in the 5-year span, and non-current assets go from 19 to 18 in the 5-year span. Looking at revenue, total of $10 billion goes up to $60 billion within the 5-year span. That's a rate of 146% in the first 3 years and 126% in the last 3 years. Expenses goes from $3 billion up to $11 billion. That's moving at a rate of 89% in the first 3 years and 52% growth in the last 3 years. Moving on to Johnson & Johnson, the total assets goes from $174 billion to $180 billion. That's a small rate of 7.14% in the first 3 years and a negative 3.88% decrease in the last 3 years. The structure of current assets, it starts at 30% current and 70% non-current, and shifts to a 32% current and a 68% non-current. Equity structure starts at 36% and moves to 39%. The total equity goes from 63.28 billion to 71.49 billion. The rate of growth is 21% in the first 3 years and a negative 7% growth decrease in the last 3 years. Liability structure is 24% current and 40% non-current in the first year and 27% current and 32% non-current in the 5th year. Johnson & Johnson's revenue goes from 82.5 billion to 88.82 billion. That's a negative 3% growth in the first 3 years and an 11.4% growth in the last 3 years. Expenses grow from 34.67 billion to 40 billion to the 5th year. The rate of growth is 2.22% in the first 3 years and 14.41% in the last 3 years. Now moving on to our final company, General Electric's total assets go from 256.21 billion to 123.14 billion. It's a big loss at a rate of negative 26.29% in the first 3 years and negative 34.8% in the last 3 years. Current asset structure goes from 33% current and 67% non-current to 30% current and 70% non-current. Equity goes from 14% to 15%, which the total equity goes from $37.07 billion to $19.56 billion. The rate of growth is a decrease of 5.83% for the first 3 years and negative 43.96% in the last 3 years. Current liability structure is 21.32 and non-current is 64.21 in the first year and 27.93 in the for current and 64.97 for non-current in the fifth year. General Electric's total revenue goes from $75.83 billion to $38.7 billion. That is decreasing at a rate of 61.75% for the first 3 years and increases a little bit at 32.82% in the last 3 years. Total expenses goes from $21.21 billion to $8 billion. That's at a decrease of 61.45% the first 3 years and another decrease of 0.6% in the last 3 years. That is my analysis of the 12 companies. Thank you so much.